Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Healthiest Voice podcast. I'm Christopher Millen, your host and the founder of Healthiest Humans. Before we dive in, Healthiest Humans and the Healthiest Voice podcast series is independent of my professional role as a pharmacist at Metro Market. The views expressed are for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or professional advice. We strongly recommend consulting a qualified healthcare or professional advisor before making any decisions based on the information provided. As you may know, Healthiest Humans are on a mission to design the best health system in the world, which is the human body when it functions in its optimal state of being. Simply put, our vision is to democratize human health, and our mission is to empower humans. Today, we're diving into the art and science of what's really in your food, understanding processed and whole foods. Our special guest, Ashley Robbins, is with us to help us unpack this topic. Ashley is a dedicated registered dietitian with a powerful mission to transform lives through nutrition. With a strong foundation in both school nutrition and clinical dietetics, Ashley has championed healthier food environments, personalized care plans, and community wellness initiatives across multiple settings. Ashley, your passion and your journey are truly inspiring, and we're absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast today. Welcome. Maybe we can start our conversation by looking at the architecture of food, and maybe we can put it in the three brackets. Like the first one is farm to plate, then it's plate to the gut, and the third one will be the gut to the cell. Can you maybe expand a little bit on the architecture of health for us?
Of course, of course. So, like you said, I'm Ashley Robbins and I am a dietitian. So definitely for sure. So as far as whenever we're thinking about, what ends up on our plate to what ends up being used in our bodies, right? We have to start with where is it coming from? So we think in those terms of, what are we purchasing? Where is that food coming from? What is the difference really between a fresh, unprocessed food versus a processed food versus like an ultra processed food? So that's something really to take into consideration. So really one thing that I do want to cover is that difference. So when we think of like a whole food, or when we hear that, we're really thinking of something that's very unprocessed. So a great example would be a fresh apple that's coming directly from the farm to your plate. It is not processed if you begin washing that and eating that. So that's what we call an unprocessed food. When we think of semi-processing or processing a little bit, that's when you're taking different foods and putting them into a recipe. So for example, if you get fresh beef from a cow, you're obviously not going to eat that fresh beef raw, right? You have to cook that. And in turn, you are processing that food. So it would be considered minimally processed, depending on what you're doing to it. So if you're just, say, grilling it, adding a few seasonings in there, that's minimally processed food. Or even if you are cutting up your fruits and vegetables for a salad, that's called a minimally processed food. And then we can go even further when we think of further processing there. Of foods like in baking, you're processing those ingredients a little bit more by baking it, mixing different ingredients together. And then we also have ultra processed foods. So this is really the hot topic right now. Currently is what exactly is an ultra processed food? How does it affect me? So ultra processed foods are those foods that are typically very, very processed. So they have things like additives added in there. They have things that keep it more shelf stable. And then, they're typically those things that you see in the grocery store, like your chips, your cookies. They're going to have more, very meal appeal to you. They have a great mouth feel because they've been changed a little bit, like, in processing. So, when we think of that ultra processed food, that's really what we're picturing, the cookies, the candies, those types of things. But I do think it's really important to really separate that and explain that process. So obviously when we eat, most of us, the biggest thing we think about when we're eating, and we get that thing from farm to plate, is, does it look good? I can tell you from experience, being in a school cafeteria, a child will reach all the way in the back for the prettiest apple, because it's all based on visual to begin with most of the time. Does it smell good? Is it appealing to me? So from there, we're then eating that food. And then a big thing now as well is the gut microbiome. How is that affecting our gut microbiome? So depending on what you're eating can really affect your gut microbiome in a positive way. And it can also have in a negative way, depending on what you're eating. So when we think of things that really feed our gut, we think of high fiber foods. Those are going to be, again, those minimally processed foods, which are typically the fresh fruits and vegetables. Whether you're processing them in your recipes and things like that, that's okay. But those are going to be those items that really feed that gut microbiome there to help maximize, a healthy eating habits. Again, and then another thing that we really see is, those ultra processed foods could potentially have negative effects on your gut microbiome, because it's going to feed the bacteria that may not, be very positive for health outcomes there, which a lot of research has shown can have those negative health outcomes, and can also potentially contribute to things like obesity, diabetes, and those types of things. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, very well, very well. So that kind of transition actually very nicely into the next question. So when a mom or a dad walks into the grocery store, decoding food labels are kind of a thing that is also on the table right now, and that people talk a lot about. So when it comes to food packaging, we all know that it can be fairly confusing, because the food companies put words like natural, organic, and fortified on the labels. So from your experience, what should people actually look for on the label to make maybe healthier choices, right?
Yeah, for sure. So when we're looking at a nutrition label, I always explain to families and individuals, okay, when we look at daily value, that percentage, right? Because a lot of people are like, I don't even know what that means, right? Or how many grams of carbohydrates do I actually need? Or is this high or is this low? So when we look at that daily value percentage, I always, we kind of define what's high, medium, and low percentage. So it's going to be high in that nutrient or that item if it's greater than or equal to 20% of that daily value percentage. It's going to be kind of in that moderate range if it's between 5 and that 20%, and then a low range if it's 5%. So that's kind of the easiest way to pick up that label and say, okay, if I'm looking for key nutrients here, like our vitamin D, or how much carbohydrates or how much added sugar is in this, I can look at that percentage and say, hey, over 20%, that's high in that nutrient, whether it's a more positive nutrient or a nutrient that we are choosing to limit in our diet. So that's a really easy way to kind of look at it. Another great way to really think about it when we're picking up different things in the grocery store is what is actually the serving size? That's a big one. So the easiest thing that comes to mind is Oreo cookies, right? Anyone can pick up a container of Oreo cookies and they just keep eating it and eating it and eating it. And then if you actually look at what the serving size is, it's only 3 cookies. So thinking about that in terms of what is the actual serving, what is the serving size, like the recommended serving size, and then what is the serving size that I'm actually eating? So, when we're comparing that, a lot of times the packages have more than one serving, especially if we're picking up those ultra processed foods. So, that can be something that's like a really easy way of looking at that percentage of daily value. And then just thinking in terms of like sodium as well. So we always need to remember that salt follows water. So if we're picking up a really high sodium product, a great example is ramen noodles. Teenagers eat them. Maybe it's just a quick grab and go. We're thinking in those terms of, okay, that's very high sodium. It actually has 60% of your daily value of sodium in one package. So, some easy quick tips there is one, salting to taste. So we need to remember that temperature affects your salt taste, right? So when it's cool down a little bit your food, it's going to taste saltier. So waiting to salt that food. And some other easy quick tips that I always recommend is trying to choose some fresh foods over those processed foods. But if you're going to purchase processed foods, that's okay. I don't really want to villainize any food group per se. It's more, how can we value add to that plate? So again, I brought up the ramen noodles thing, right? Lots of kids eat them. Lots of adults eat them. They're easy. They take 3 minutes in the microwave. How can we value add to that to where it's at least a little bit more nutritional? So my recommendation that I always give, especially to teenagers, is, hey, use 1/3 of the packet of seasoning. And then I'm going to recommend that you add in some either fresh or frozen vegetables that you can throw in the microwave and steam. Add that to your ramen noodles. So at least you're getting some amount of nutrition there. You're getting either fresh broccoli in there, and we're introducing maybe a new food that you may not have had before. And we're getting the nutrition from there. And then we've reduced your sodium just by cutting that seasoning packet. And it's a really easy change that's more actionable. And it's not me saying, hey, you need to completely change your diet and throw out all these foods and approaching it, instead of a blame and shame, just from a how can we value add to your plate.
Yeah, very well. So this last year I actually went and I visited my brother in England, and I walk into the grocery store, and obviously I'm very mindful of the labels there. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, Ashley, but they do have this color system where it's green, yellow, and red. So when you look at the box, you turn it around, you almost just by glancing at it, you don't even need to read the the sodium, the fiber, all the different DVs that is on there. You basically just need to look at the color coding, and automatically you kind of are flagged for it for the better or for the worse, right? So I know right now it's actually a hot topic in DC too, where the FDA is working on maybe to take some of the food labeling from the back and put it on the front, right? So it will be interesting to see what they will come up with. Do you have anything to say about that? Do you think it will actually help if we actually bring some of that labeling from the back to the front?
So I definitely think it's always helpful to put the labeling front and center for people to see and for ease of access, right? And I do think, that's something we actually teach in schools. We call it WHO, slow and go. And we color coordinate that too, with saying, hey, if it's green, this is more of a go food. If it's yellow, this is more of a whoa every once in a while. And if it's a red food, it's very, very every once in a while, we're going to slow down on those. So that's something that, a lot of schools try to implement already. And I think that could be very helpful for individuals who are really going through the grocery store and trying to figure out, hey, what's going to be the best bang for our buck, and then also help me to nourish my body in the best way possible, and everything. So yeah, I do think that would be helpful. And they did show in some studies, a couple of years ago, they passed a law that if you had over, I believe, 20 restaurants, you had to post like the calories and things like that, where it was very visible to the public. in a way to help them make healthier choices. Some of the research showed that it didn't make a huge difference, whereas some of the research, it was a mixed bag of research showing that, okay, sometimes people would select a smaller size or a smaller portion as a result of seeing those calories front and center, or maybe they really rethought their choices when they were selecting that coffee and they saw the amount of calories that was in that meal because it was right in front of their face. But it was a very mixed bag there. So I would be interested to see, what the long-term research would show if they implemented that. But I do think that it would be helpful for families to kind of decode and make it a lot more simplified for them.
Yeah, I agree on that. So let's change gears to the hidden cost of convenience. We all love convenience. We want to go through the drive-through, and comfort is king nowadays. But we also know that processed foods are often marked as quick and easy, right? But what would you say are the hidden health risks that comes with these ultra processed foods, in particular the convenience factor that's kind of baked into that almost, right?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. So obviously, we know for the most part that ultra processed foods tend to be higher in salt and sugar and in the fats that you really don't want to consume on a regular basis. So that obviously leads to things like excess weight gain, diabetes, heart disease, and increase in cancer risk and all of those different types of things. So that's really truly, at its core, the true hidden cost of, always reaching for easy grab and go foods. For sure. So again, the biggest thing is when we're consuming them frequently, right? So if we're only reaching for them, every once in a while, that's not going to necessarily impact our health to the severe extent. But if it's something that you're reaching for every day, hey, I'm going through the drive-through every day from a convenience standpoint, that's obviously going to negatively impact your health. And then another thing to consider there is if you're going through the drive-through or you're reaching for that convenience food, then what are you doing when you're consuming that food, right? Something to think about, right? So a lot of times when we're really, I call it like, you're really moving in the fast lane and you've got so many things to do, we're not taking that time to sit down and actually eat and think about what we're eating and monitoring, our feeling of fullness either. You're either in the car, in the drive-thru, and you're like, hey, I got to eat this hamburger really fast because I have to get to the next thing. Or a lot of times you're sitting in front of the TV and eating. And most of the time what happens when we're sitting in the TV, which research has shown this to be accurate, is we eat significantly more when we are distracted. So when we're sitting in front of the TV or scrolling on our phones and eating and not really having that communal meal where we're sitting down and thinking about it, we're eating 20% or more calories than we would normally eat if we were sitting at a table and taking that time to eat and thinking about our feeling of fullness. And then I really think another thing to consider as well when we're talking about processed foods is looking at the big picture too, is, does that individual have the cooking and food preparation skills? Because that can really impact, I can lead someone to all the fresh fruits and vegetables and all the great healthy foods, but if they don't have the capability to actually prepare those foods, that individual is not going to eat those foods. Is it culturally acceptable to them as well? So again, leading them to all these great foods, if it's not within their cultural norm, they're less likely to eat that food. And then, like you mentioned, time capabilities. If we're looking at different individuals, lots of people have families now. Maybe they have small children or even teenage children, and they're having to rush. So that can really impact that. And then as well as equipment capabilities and household budget. So I personally have met individuals, that's a question that we ask typically in clinical is, do you have access to electricity, running water? Do you have access to a refrigerator? And do you have access to cooking equipment? And it's not something you would think about that we would have to ask, living in the United States, but it is a question that I ask to figure out, okay, what is their capability? Maybe they only have a microwave. What recommendations can I make there? And it's a lot more frequent than you would think of individuals saying, oh, I don't have adequate access to a refrigerator or to an oven. I only have a microwave. So then, being able to make those recommendations to them that are still helpful and healthy for them, with some minor changes here and there.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's it's interesting, the whole balance between, whole foods and the price of foods and ultra processed foods, which are supposedly more are cheaper foods, right? So on that topic of cost and, running a whole foods household on a budget, many people actually think that eating whole and unprocessed foods is expensive, right? So what are some realistic ways to eat healthier without breaking the bank? Basic to the point that you already started touching on, right? I mean, the point is not everybody do have the means to actually afford high-end organic or high-end high-quality food. So how do we help these people that are in food deserts and that do not have always access to either resources or the food itself? How can we, come alongside them and make it fairly reasonable, to not break the bank for them?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. And that's one I get a lot of, hey, how do I balance this with my budget? Especially, we think now, like, we see our grocery bills and we're like, whoa, like the grocery prices just seem to keep going up, right? So some easy things I recommend is, again, going back to how can we value add to the meals maybe you're already purchasing on your budget, to add in more nutrition there, and then hopefully that will shift their thought process to say, okay, I've tried these new foods, I've had that value added, now I'm going to add in slowly more and more of these more healthful foods. So some ways that I do that on a budget is, I always recommend frozen fruits and vegetables, as long as they're flash frozen and either in water. There's no huge nutritional difference there between fresh. So the advantage to that is when you have your frozen vegetables, and a lot of times you can just throw them in the microwave. They have no seasonings on them, so it's just just like eating broccoli, for example. That's something I do all the time. I buy frozen broccoli and I can throw it in the microwave and then it's ready. So that's very economical for a few reasons. First of all, it's economical because it's going to hold in your freezer, and you can keep that in your freezer for a long term versus, say, buying fresh broccoli. That's probably only going to last you a week. And if you forget to use that product, well, now you're just throwing that in the trash and you've got no nutritional value out of it. The other thing is, from a convenience standpoint, which we touched on earlier, is, a lot of people really want more convenience food, but this is actually a healthy convenience food because it's just the product flash frozen with nothing in it, like no sodium, nothing like that. And then they can put it in the microwave, or they can use it in their recipes over the oven and cook that up really fast. So we have that value added there to their recipes. And then same thing with fruits. So we know that typically fruits can be fairly expensive when we're thinking in terms of the serving size as well as the shelf life. So if you want to buy fresh fruits, I think that's awesome and great. And if you have that capability, one way you can keep a longer shelf life for your fruits is you can actually process them yourself by washing them, cutting them up, and then putting them in freezer bags. If they're getting close to, hey, they're kind of getting close to that point where I don't have to quite throw them away, but maybe I should put them in like a smoothie form, or I should use it in my baking if I'm going to bake, some fresh fruit based items. So freezing them, and again, you can pre-package them in little baggies and then you can use them in your recipe. And the same thing with fresh vegetables. when we're thinking in terms of time, is pre-processing them yourself. When I say pre-processing, I mean, say you have an onion, you're washing that onion, you're cutting up that onion for your future recipes, and you're putting them in a Ziploc bag and you're freezing it. So then when you're ready with your fresh meat, say at dinner, you can just throw in those vegetables and they're already ready for you without them going bad in the refrigerator. So that's a really good way to get a little bit better bang for your buck, with integrating in those really good whole foods in a very simple way.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but you probably don't know it, but I grew up in Africa, and a really good story that ties in right to your point. Back in the days, my mom, because we lived way out in the boondoos, my mom will go once a month. Okay, every 4 weeks, she will go to the big city and go to the grocery store and buy, basically, to your point, fruits and vegetables that are frozen, and then she will put it in the deep freeze, and then through the 3-4 weeks we'll kind of use that as on an ongoing basis. So to your point, I mean, that is probably the takeaway that I will take away from that point, because there's so much value, and for some reason frozen fruits and vegetables are actually fairly cheap, compared to some, if it's fresh. So I actually told my daughter, I mean, we talked earlier a little bit about what students are doing, and that's actually a very real thing for a lot of students on campus now. If they do not live in the dorms, they actually go to the grocery stores, they buy these frozen packs of fruits and vegetables, and then just use it as needed. So yeah, that's a really good point. Moving on to the science of cravings. So I love chocolate cake, and I know that processed foods are designed by design to be addictive. So what ingredients or techniques do food companies manufacture or use to keep us hooked, and how can we break free from those cravings? I've sort of overcome my sweet craving over the last 5 years, walking on my own wellness journey. But for the average guy out there, it's extremely hard to break those addictive habits, right? So, any suggestions what you have for the audience?
Yeah. So of course we know what makes processed foods taste so good, right? We think about, it's that great combination: sweet, so that sugar, that salt, and then fat, right? And then we think of how they're processing it to have optimal mouthfeel, look very appealing, to where you see it on the shelf and like, oh, that looks really good. So those are things that really have us gravitate toward those foods, right? And then, of course, it's instant. So I don't have to do any processing there. I can just open up that package and pop it in my mouth, and, I get that instant gratification there. And then another big thing is advertising, right? I think a big challenge we have in the US is we do not ban advertising to children for foods and especially ultra processed foods. So then, our kids are seeing it on YouTube and on commercials and things like that. And their advertising is really, really good to make them want to ask their parents, hey, I want to get this food. And even as adults, we see it, for example, like an ad for a fast food, like, oh, that looks really good. And they're really good at making those foods look delicious. But then a lot of times when you actually get it, you're like, it doesn't look at all like the commercial. But it's good at pulling you in to want to make that purchase. So that's really a lot of times what those food manufacturers are doing. It's really that three-prong front. So it's that food advertising to get you really interested. It's really manufacturing those foods to have that sugar, salt, and high fat content. And then it's really doing a good job of giving that mouth feel to make you want to crave it. So again, when we speak about like breaking free from the cravings, we really want to think about, like we talked about earlier, like what's the serving size of those different foods, and trying to really, if we're going to have them, try to stick to those serving sizes. Like we talked about a little bit earlier, of instead of picking up that ultra processed food and eating it on the go, say, hey, I'm going to sit down. I'm really going to, if I am going to eat that food, I'm going to, have that moment to actually eat it versus eating it in front of the TV or eating it scrolling on my phone, because then you're more likely to eat more of it. And then again, thinking about if we are going to eat those foods, how can we value add to them by either adding in fruits or vegetables to that, and then just trying to eat them in moderation. I know it's something that's very, very difficult to break free of. And, I think an easy way is just minimizing your exposure to them. So if you're at the grocery store, just saying, hey, if I don't have them in my house, I'm less likely to eat them. So that's kind of an easy way too. And then just, at the end of the day, if we villainize certain foods or food groups, a lot of times what people tend to do as a result say, oh, if you're going to tell me I can't have those foods, then I'm going to want to have those foods. So just, you're really doing it in moderation, and knowing when it's appropriate to have those foods. Does that kind of answer your question, or do you have any follow-ups to that?
No, absolutely. And I love the exposure part that you talked about. So the lesson that I've learned over the last 5 years, the overarching lesson that I've learned is that if you want to change anything, anywhere, anytime, there's two conditions. The first thing is you need to change the environment. And the second thing is you need to change the conditions in the environment. And that's exactly to your point. So if you can limit the exposure either through going to the grocery store, the advertising, the stimulating of the taste buds and whatnot, I mean, that is the thing that needs to change in that. So taking a step back and, backing up the entire conversation, I want to ask you one last question. What is the one simple change that people can make to make this transition from ultra processed food to whole foods, right? I mean, in the end, we know that it's unavoidable to have processed foods, right? Ultra processed foods is negotiable, but on that continuum, all the way from ultra processed all the way to whole foods, what is the one simple change that the average guy across the entire spectrum of socioeconomics, right, can actually implement tomorrow morning when they wake up to make a transition from the left to the right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one easy recommendation I always make, when people are trying to make more healthful choices, is looking at the beverages that they're drinking. Because what a lot of people don't realize is the beverages that they're drinking tend to be, one, ultra processed, right? And they tend to be higher in calories and sugar and fat. So one easy, simple change is just switching to water. It's economical. It doesn't really cost people that much money. So that's one easy change right there, to say, hey, I've met patients or individuals who are saying, hey, I drink 8 Cokes a day, right? And to us, that might seem, extreme, but to them, that's their norm. So saying, okay, let's start by reducing the number of sodas you're drinking per day. I'm not going to ask you to cut off cold turkey, because that's probably not going to be successful. But let's start slowly by reducing, it by 2 per week over over a month, and replacing that with water. Not only is that healthier, but it's more economical for them too, because then they're not going out and purchasing those Cokes. So when we talk about how does that impact our grocery bill, it can impact in an easy way. And then another thing is looking at that's really actionable, is like we talked about before, is looking at how can we value add to our plate. So I think the goal should always be, or what I tell individuals is, your plate should be as colorful as possible on there. So really sticking to that goal of like, hey, I want to make sure my plate's really colorful. It's not all just beige in that one color scheme. And, how can I value add to that? Hey, I can chop up some fresh fruits and vegetables and put that on my plate, whether they're cooked or they're raw vegetables that I can dip in like a low fat dressing or something like that. That's an easy, actionable way to just start integrating in those small habits in the beginning. And then, kind of like I touched on with, students or even adults who eat ramen noodles, we're value adding there. Like, yes, ramen noodles is not the optimal choice, but if you're going to tell me that you're absolutely going to refuse to give those up, okay, then let me give you a value added opportunity there to say, hey, we're going to cut that seasoning packet in half, so then you have less sodium there. And then I want you to add in some fresh steamed broccoli or a fresh steamed vegetable in there that you enjoy eating. So at least you're getting some positive nutrition there on your journey in the right direction. And then, like I said before, I think the biggest thing when working with an individual or if they're like on their health journey is not to villainize any specific food or food group, because that tends to lead to disordered eating patterns or eating disorders. If we just say, hey, you can absolutely not have this, because there is always a time and a place for every food. When we think of cakes, okay, it's not something we're going to be eating every day, but if we were to have a birthday, that's a situation where that's acceptable to do. So just really, working not to say, hey, you absolutely have to wipe out everything and wipe your slate clean, because that's really in the long run not likely to make somebody successful on their journey to a healthier them.
Wow, thank you so much, Ashley. Yeah, my takeaway on this last point is sugar water. Sugar water. We know that if we can just make that one change, instead of maybe drinking 3 Cokes a day to maybe 1. I drink nothing. I can't remember when the last time I had a sugar beverage, but everything is loaded with sugar, and we want to try and bring that down, because those calories are deadly, right? So Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate that. Your passion for nutrition and wellness have truly enriched this conversation, and I'm grateful for your time and your expertise, and we know our listeners will walk away feeling inspired and informed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
All right, you have a great evening. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.